Hello everyone, it's so great to see such a good turnout this evening. I'm Kathy Pineo, I'm the head of Regenerative Learning and Design here at the RSA. My role is really focused on how we build capabilities to support people and ecosystems to flourish, and I work on different RSA interventions like Playful Green Planet. Playful Green Planet is run in partnership with Spa University and Eden Project, and we're looking at how we can transform how children connect with nature and community through outdoor creative play, but drawing on the expertise and talents of local individuals, coalitions and communities to transform spaces into outdoor playrooms and classrooms that grow children's capabilities and social and environmental activism. So with that in mind, it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker this evening, someone whose work has summarized the evidence linking nature to well-being. And today we are joined by Kathy Willis. Kathy is a professor of biodiversity at the University of Oxford. She is also a crossbench peer in the House of Lords. Previous roles include Director of Science at the Royal Botanical Gardens, Kew, and a member of the UK Government Natural Capital Committee. In 2015, Kathy was awarded the Michael Faraday Medal for Public Communication of Science from the Royal Society. She has since dedicated her research in proving the link between the amount of green spaces in our lives and better health, mood, and longevity. For the first time ever, scientific findings from the past 15 years are brought together in her book, Good Nature. So, for today's session, Kathy's going to give us a brief opening address, introducing some of the key themes, and then we're going to get a chance to go deeper into conversation and bring you all in. So if you're watching online, you can drop your questions in the YouTube chat or on our social media using the hashtag RSA Nature. Do get your questions ready, and I'll be taking as many as possible from the room and online before we wrap up at 7. But now, without further ado, please join us in welcoming Kathy Willis.
So thank you very much, and it's wonderful to be here this evening with so many people in the room. So I'm going to give just sort of 15, 20 minutes on the key scientific concepts behind the work that I've been pulling together, very much a lot of the work that's in the book that I published last year. And the book came about because I kept coming across a study which was published in 1984 in a very good journal, Science, one of our top science journals, showing that people looked out of hospital windows onto trees after gallbladder operations versus brick walls recovered 3 times faster. Why? Really odd question and a really odd result, especially in science, where I want to sort of kick the tires and think, well, hang on a moment. I have to say I'm quite a skeptical scientist, so I'm always saying, well, what's your evidence base? What's your sample size? And I'm just going to give you some of the evidence base that I've come across, and you'll see, and then there's loads of time for questions at the end. But the thing I first want to say is, of course, that in policy, we have already recognised, I would say very much so, that we should be interacting in green space. If you look at the environmental, the UK policy, the Environmental Improvement Plan, we've now got this statement that everyone should be within 15-minute walk of green or blue space. And then we have international policies. This was agreed at the Conference of Parties for Biodiversity in 2022, and 189 countries signed up to this. So this is a really big, large global community saying that we need to significantly increase the access to green space in urban areas to improve human health and well-being. So we all, I think everyone in this room and everyone on the screen will probably agree that we know that they should have access to green space. And it's linked with this improved physical and mental well-being. So if you look in something like Lancet, all these really top science journals, literally every couple of months there's a new study, but this is one I just want to pick up on, which looked at the population, it looked at 2.3 million adults living in Wales, and over 10 years, and they compared their mental health records, and they geolocated where everyone lived, all 2.3 million people geolocated where they lived, and they looked at, is there a relationship between common mental diseases, as in their health records, and access to green space, including and regardless of their socioeconomic background. And what they found is that there were lower odds of having common mental diseases, and that actually every 360 metres you were further away from that green space, the more common mental diseases you had. But this is the most interesting thing, is that the positive effects were greater on people of in those lower socioeconomic quintiles. So it's not just well, that's because you're wealthy, you've got more green space, and therefore, that less mental illnesses. Actually showed very clearly that this is really important for people in those lower socioeconomic quintiles. But the point I also really want to make, and I make very clearly in the book, it's not just mental health. So if we look at this is Toronto, lovely city, many things going for it. The best thing as a scientist is they've mapped every single tree in Toronto, and they also have this fantastic health. They have these cardiovascular and the general health. What are they called? The health records, the biobank, the population biobank records, which record everyone's health records in there. And what they found is the more trees you had, the less cardiometabolic conditions you had. So people had less heart attacks, for example, the more trees they had on their streets. And they had a significantly higher self-rated health perception. So, what sort of green space then do we need? Is all green space equal? Because if this is the case, it's great, we can put football pitches everywhere. Mm-hmm. Now, a lot of this says 15 minutes green space from your home. So I did a trial. I walked 15 minutes from my home to the different green spaces I could access. So first of all, I'm very lucky, I have the University of Oxford's Botanic Gardens. Secondly, that's my dog for scale. That's the football pitch, which is very near to us. I have the university parks, and I have a community garden. And then finally, there's a forested area quite close to me. So are there particular aspects of this green space that are better than others and lead to these positive health outcomes? And it is a really relevant question because there's a lot of prescribing of nature going on. But I feel extremely sorry for GPs because they're very general. We're not giving them the details about how long should you walk for, where should you walk for, are there particular aspects of nature that are really helpful for improving health and physical and mental health. And this is that's where I sort of started with this book. And I would argue, and I do argue at the end of the book, that actually what we need to do, if we really want to start to prescribe nature, we have to treat it in exactly the same way as we're treating any prescription drug. Because with a prescription drug, first of all, a medic will know what are the specific interactions with nature that lead to positive physical and mental health outcomes. So what sort of drug do you take? If you've got a headache, you take an aspirin or a paracetamol. So if you've got high blood pressure, what sort of nature should you go near? The second thing is, what happens? What is the mechanism of action that happens in the body when you interact with that nature? Is it just some general well-being feeling, or do things actually go on? The third thing is, how long do you need to take the drug for? How long do you need to interact with nature to get those benefits? And finally, and this is the one that economists always want to know, what's the cost of interacting with nature and its efficacy versus taking a prescription drug? So in the next 15 minutes, I'm going to scoot through some examples, and then I'm sure there will be plenty of questions at the end about this. So what I came across when I started to pull this all together is actually what we find is the research is broadly focused around our senses, the different senses that interact with nature. So I call them the green senses. The first is to do with the shape and the density and colour of vegetation. The second is to do with the smell, the volatile organic compounds that you smell when you smell a plant scent like lavender. The third one is the sound, bird song, water sound. The fourth one is touch, about actually what happens when you touch different sorts of woods and plants. And finally, there's not one on taste, but there is one in a hidden sense, which is the environmental microbiome. Now, I haven't got time to go through all of those, but I will, and the book does, but I will just pick on 3 to give you some of the more diverse examples that have come through. Right, so let me start with these first 2 questions then. What specific interactions with nature lead to positive physical and mental health outcomes? So what type of drug? And the second one is, what actions are triggered in our bodies when we interact with these aspects of nature? So let me start with this very simple thing. This is on a computer screen. These women, they're not wearing a blindfold, it's actually just to hide their identity. These women, 17, 15 female university students, were shown a picture of a forest or a picture of a skyscraper, a city landscape. And they looked at physiological mechanisms in the body. So they looked at heart rate variability, they looked at brain activity, and then they looked at their psychological well-being through doing questionnaires. And what they found, if you look at the top thing there, that is your city image, and the one at the bottom is your forest image. Within 90 seconds, that there is showing that they were physiologically calmer by looking at the trees rather than looking at the city image. So if ever there's when you've got your screensaver for your computer, put a tree on it. Take away any cityscapes. But also their psychological measurement, they felt much happier when they were looking, after they'd looked at the trees, than when they looked at the city. So what is it? Is it the colour, or is it the shape? Well, first of all, colour. And this is a lovely experiment. So this is using ivy leaves. Ivy is fantastic because it hybridizes all the time. You get all these different colours. So the same shape, the same size, but different colours. And what they did on this, they wired up these individuals' brains, and they looked at parts of the brain where they know there's sort of neural activity occurring to see if you see different colours, do you get a different reaction to it? And what they found in here very clearly was actually the ones that you're most relaxed, and the colours will be you're most relaxed when you look at these leaves, are the green and yellow and the green and white leaves. Physiologically, for some reason, your body is much calmer when you look at those leaves than if you look at the red leaves, in houseplants at least. And I'll come back to that at the end if someone asks a question about this. But the other really interesting thing in here is what they also found is that the area of the brain that linked through sort of anger and the tensions increased when we looked at red leaves. So you should not have those poinsettias on the Christmas table. This is always a very... But what about shape? And this I found really, really interesting, particularly in the sort of RSA. What about shape on a landscape? Because when you think about all those paintings of landscapes, rarely do you see a painting of a landscape which is dense forest. More often, think about constables, think about all of these landscapes where you have a few trees on a landscape and a more open landscape. Now, I found this really fascinating, and I hope you do too. Because when you're looking at the horizon in a picture or even a landscape, what your eye is doing is it's effectively what they're showing, it's picking out the fractal dimension of the horizon. So it does a quick scan over, and then it's picking out the fractal dimension. Now, fractal dimensions, for those of you who are not up to speed on this, is when things can divide into itself. Think about coastlines. You'll see a big bay, a smaller bay, a smaller bay, a smaller bay in there. It's the same with vegetation. So here we've got a tree here at the top there. You've got your bigger branches. You go down into the branch, you see a next scale down. Go down further, see another. So it keeps repeating the pattern as you go down and down. Now, think of a horizon. So these are 3 different fractal dimensions on the horizon. The one at the top is a coniferous forest, 1.5. The one down here is 1.3, and this one of the cityscape is 1.2. So this one in the middle, 1.3, is a savanna landscape. So how does that affect us? Okay, so this is a really nice experiment where they didn't look at photos, they just looked at computer-generated fractal dimensions on a screen, and they wired up the brains of these individuals to look at their brainwave activity. And they looked at these 4 horizons, these 4 fractal pictures. So I'm going to try it on everyone in the audience. So have a quick look at those 4. And which ones do you most prefer? Let's start. Put up your hand if you prefer A, B, C, and D. Right, so you all prefer A and B. I'd say there's slightly more Bs than As. That's 1.14. That's 1.3. That's 1.5. And that's 1.7. Let's go back to seeing what the results showed on people's brainwave activity. What they found is that the fractional dimension of 1.3 induced the largest positive changes in the subject's EEG, the electrical activity in the brain's response. And particularly, they had heightened alpha frequency, which is associated with increased wakefulness and a more relaxed state. They had a reduced delta frequency, so they were less sleepy, which is good for a lecture. And finally, they had a heightened beta frequency, which is also associated with being more increased external focus and attention. What sort of landscape brings those sort of responses? It's that one. And so it is this now, why is a whole field in itself. Some people think it's sort of some out of Africa hypothesis, others think it's not. I don't think that matters. I think the important thing is when you're looking at horizon and when you're looking at pictures of landscapes, which one will actually bring about greater sense of calm and physiological and psychological calming, and it will be this more open landscape. And our ancestors, our artist ancestors, had it right. And Capability Brown, think about those landscapes that he created. They're very manufactured landscape, but they're very much an open landscape with scattered trees. Okay, let's move on then. Let's think about smell. Another one. Now this to me was a complete shock, I have to say, when I worked on it. So when you smell, you go into pine forest, you will smell that very distinctive lemony scent. What you're smelling is the volatile organic compounds from those trees. So effectively, it's compounds that are released by the tree. They're volatile, or they volatilize when they're released into the air. That's that gas, and that's the smell. So let's look at limonene, which is very much one of that piney smells you get. They had a funnel in front of women's noses and men in a clinical environment, and they just puffed out that limonene smell. And what they found, when you had that smell coming out, you had basically your heart rate was changed to be, the parasympathetic heart rate was increased, which is you're more physiologically relaxed, and you had a lower heartbeat. But also they felt clinically psychologically much calmer. Now, is this just cultural? They tried the same experiment out on 8-week-old babies and found the same result. So it's nothing to do with whether or not your mother was cutting up lemons when you were young. There seems to be something going on. What's going on? Right, so this is a really nice thing, and I think this always surprised me. So they measured people's bloods before and after they walked in a pine forest. So at the top here, first one here, is the pine forest. Just look at that arrow with 2 there. So that is the amount of pinene compound in the air in the forest. The second one down then is, you'll see number 2 there, really quite a small peak. That was in the participants' blood before they walked in the forest. Now look at 2 after they've walked in the forest. So what's happening? When you walk and you smell that plant smell, you don't just breathe it in and breathe it out again. Some of those compounds pass across your lung membrane into your blood, and once in your blood, they interact with some of the same biochemical pathways as if you're taking particular drugs. So lavender actually does reduce anxiety because it interacts with that same biochemical pathway as if you're taking an anti-anxiety drug. It makes you more sleepy. And there are other ones in here. Now, this is a lot of this stuff is just coming through now, but I think for me, the fact that you take on part of the plant was a really extraordinary result. But even more than that was this one, which is hinoki. So this is Japanese cypress, and I think in my pocket here, I hope, somewhere, yes I do, I have a small pot of this. If you'd like to smell it, since we're talking about smell, I can hand it down and you can pass it around, but I'd like it back. If you'd like to smell what it smells like, here you go, that's hinoki oil. So this is the Japanese cypress. It's rather confusingly called the Japanese cedar someplace, but it is actually cupressaceae. It is a cypress plant. And in this experiment, men slept in a hotel bedroom. They puffed this stuff out from diffusers for 3 nights, keeping everything else equal. And what they found, when they measured their urine after 3 nights, there's a significant reduction in the adrenaline hormone. So they were much calmer, so it affected their endocrine system. But even more interesting, you can see the statistical significance in here, they had a large increase in their natural killer cells in their blood. Now, natural killer cells are the things that we all want higher levels of because they attack the cancer and virus cells in our bodies. So this is giving your immune system a really big boost by smelling this, which I want that back. Now, that study was published in 2009, quite a long time ago. This one was published in Oncotarget, a good cancer biology journal, a very good cancer biology. And what they did was they looked, in 2 experiments here, they looked at, first of all, the concentration of natural killer cells in the blood of 90 university colleagues who lived in houses situated in the forest environment, so in the cypress forest, versus those who lived outside. But they also sent some to walk in the forest to see what happens to natural killer cells in their bloods. What they found, those that lived in the forest naturally had much higher natural killer cells in their blood, but those who went to walk saw a significant increase in their natural killer cells after that walk. But even more important than that, that lasted for 7 days after their walk. So it's not only giving you a short-term boost, but it's actually a long-term boost in your immune in your ability to fight off some of these viruses and even cancers. Right, last one I'm going to talk about is the environmental microbiome, which is one probably most people know least about, but you do know about it because we're constantly being told to take probiotic drinks to increase the biota in our guts and the bacteria, the good bacteria. Well, those good bacteria are all around us in biodiverse environments as well. So that if you walk in those environments, does your body take on and do we adopt that environmental microbiome? So I'm going to give one example, I think. Who better than to pick on would be small nursery school-aged children. And these children, there are plenty of experiments. These are beautiful experiments published 2 years ago. 79 children, kindergarten, played in a sand pit, which was sterile, or a sand pit which had been seeded with soil from the boreal forest, so from the coniferous forest. So it's full of this sort of local bacteria. And they took blood samples from the children. They also measured the bacteria in their skin, on their skin, and in their stool. What did they find? This should make anyone stop, because actually this one here, in comparison to, first of all, the children that played in the microbial diverse sand, had a significant shift to all those good bacteria that we're always drinking these probiotic drinks to try and get in their gut. But also, linked to that, in their blood plasma, they found that there was this really big increase, significant increase in the T cells that we all want to have, because these basically give you enhanced immune system functioning. In the same way as we're being told about, eating the probiotic foods to do the same can happen, but with the interacting in these environments. And when you measure the environments, which part of your green space would you get this in? You get them, the more biodiverse the green space, the better the environmental microbiome. In fact, what they found is that with the football pitch, that in fact you don't really want to be on the football pitch, because they found actually there were more pathogenic bacteria there than anything else. So actually we'll keep away from that one. Right, so finally, or the last 2 points, I'll just go very quickly through these. How long do we need to interact? And this is a lovely study where they took faculty staff from Michigan University, sent them out to walk or sit or run, and that's my preference on the far right-hand side, but there are others that prefer these other things in there. And they looked at salivary biomarkers. So they looked at a measure of stress in the saliva through salivary amylase and cortisol, really good enzyme biomarkers. And what they found is that actually the best time is 21 to 30 minutes. You don't get much more benefit beyond that. But also, and this will irritate anyone who's a runner, you had more reduction in those stress levels if you sat. Right, so finally, what's the relative efficacy of these different things? Well, this is a very brief study. They sent people who'd been off work for at least a year, clinically depressed, anxiety, they had all these anxiety symptoms, and they did 21-hour sessions of cognitive behavioral therapy, which is a usual therapy, or they spent 3 weekly sessions over those 10 weeks in the University of Copenhagen's garden. What did they find? Well, after both of them were very, very successful, that they found that actually after both treatments, after the intervention, people went back to work, and basically that they both worked. But the most important thing that they found is that when they went back a year later, 77% of those who did the garden treatment were back at work, compared to 60% on cognitive behavioral therapy, which I found really surprising. I was expecting CBT to be the one, because of course it is giving you the mechanisms, or learning mechanisms to deal with stress. Right, so just to go back to those questions, then we'll move on to, I'm sure there are questions now from everyone in the audience. Which specific interactions? Well, I think we've got sight, we've got sound, we've got smell, we've got touch, we've got these hidden senses. It affects a number of different pathways in there, and we're not only talking about autonomic systems, but also our endocrine systems. It's also affecting our psychological well-being, but also parts of the sort of plant are going inside us and actually affecting our internal metabolic processes. How long? 20 minutes. There are so many studies out there saying 20 minutes 3 times a week, 120 minutes a week is what you need. Not much more, but definitely not less. And what's the efficacy? Very few studies on this so far, but those coming through show that it's much, some of these treatments can be as good, but also a lot cheaper. So we go right the way back to Hippocrates. I mean, he said nature is the physician of diseases. I think I'd agree with that. We know now that non-communicable diseases, with many of them triggered by stress, they kill 41 million people globally each year, 71%, because we've got so good at dealing with the communicable diseases, and this is a really big issue now. Certain interaction, absolutely, the evidence is there, but we now need to have the framework in which to deal with it. But I would say we're still not approaching it in the way that is necessarily helping the medical profession to be able to take these things. And my book, if anything, is a small step towards that, to say, here is the evidence, but there's so much more to be done. And we absolutely need to learn from medicine as to what is the evidence base that's needed to really be able to start to use nature in this way. So I hope that gives you some background to what I've been doing, and I'll now hand over to questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Kathy. That was incredible. I know.
And I have got it back.
You can rest easy tonight.
Oh, you didn't smell it there? Okay, good. Here you go.
For myself, I was quite surprised about the amount of evidence around smell, touch, and obviously the kind of hidden nature that you were talking about. One of the big questions I had while I read your book was, what was the element that surprised you most? What was the piece of evidence that kind of took you back and changed the way you do things, your own personal behavior?
I think smell. I really hadn't. I thought I knew about sight. I had a pretty good idea. Seeing, probably hearing. We know quite a lot about biodiversity and sound, but the minute I saw that data showing those pinene levels in blood, and then I looked at things like lavender, for example, was really interesting. There's the compounds of lavender, when they put people in sleep chambers and puff out lavender and then look at, because I'd always thought lavender was an old wives' tale. It's like, oh yes, that's all very nice. But actually, I suddenly realized that actually when they showed people have longer sleep and deeper sleep if they have lavender, for example, on the pillow. But so smell was a real, and now, I have diffusers in my home with that hinoki oil in my office puffing away. And of course, you need to keep it at those sort of ambient levels that you'd expect to find in a forest. I wouldn't suggest one puts one's head over a sort of a whole thing of hinoki oil. But if we know that is what is happening when you smell those things, why on earth wouldn't you start to bring them into your everyday life? So smell was the most interesting for me.
Great. And then I'm going to ask you to imagine that you have a magic wand. You're able to do any study you want in a month's time, in any place in the world, with any sample size, any type of test subject. What is the research question you're going to answer based on your book?
Oh. Well, one of the things that does... from the book, I think this has been a real journey for me as well. I started with one idea of what this book was going to be like, and I ended up being completely different. Because anyone that reads it, you'll see towards the end, I start to think, okay, I can adapt that, I can do this. But one of my questions is green space. If you're thinking about urban areas, and 70% of us will live in urban areas in the next, by 2050, what do we need to have in urban areas? It's all good saying we do forest bathing and you can get a train out to the forest, but how many of us are going to do that? So what can you bring to your own house? And if it's pouring with rain and freezing cold, where can you go that you'll still get the benefits? And so I have to say, started to do this work in Oxford by looking at the different glass houses in the Botanic Gardens, which have all got a completely different smell profile. And we've had students sitting in them for 20 minutes and measuring physiological and psychological parameters to see after 20 minutes which glass house is best. Because to me, it might sound really small scale, but it's coming back to if you're going to give evidence to the medical profession, you need to give really pragmatic evidence rather than I could have a fantastic biodiversity of the world, but actually at the end of the day, if we're looking to help people's health, then we need to be thinking about the glass houses. And our pilot studies show big differences.
My last question, because I know that there are lots in the audience, I wanted to speak to kind of gaps in evidence, so where you think more work needs to be done, specifically in terms of looking at if and how there are cultural differences that influence the connection between nature and well-being.
So cultural differences is an interesting one. I think there are cultural differences in terms of colour, and there are in terms of whether or not we, if you prefer a much more a wild landscape versus a more ordered. So you'll start to see that people are, that there are cultural, and the few studies have been done. But there aren't cultural differences when you start to deal with things that are actually inside your body. So smell, there isn't really a cultural difference, because it's not about whether or not you like the smell, it's about what the smell actually does to you. And it's the same with the environmental microbiome. There aren't cultural differences there. There are good bacteria and there are bad bacteria, and they are the same the world over. So I think it's easy to say, well, that might work for people in the UK, but it won't work for people in Southeast Asia. But actually, many of the studies actually are global, or that they've been carried out in different groups. And also, I think with those two in particular, I can see no reason why there would be cultural differences.
Amazing. Well, I'd love to take some questions from the audience. So let's take you.
Thank you. So I was very intrigued by the smell findings, and I just wanted to confirm, is this really only for the natural substance, or would a diffuser, which could be an artificial smell, actually invoke the same reaction? Or is it aromatherapy with natural...
It's the natural smells, it's the biogenic volatile organic compounds. And in fact, some of those other chemical smells are really not good for you.
Yeah, okay.
So, I now do buy some of the oils and diffuse them just as you would. And it's quite interesting because I think with aromatherapy, probably, you know, think about aromatherapy, some of the reactions that probably come about from aromatherapy are as a result, I would say, I would guess, are a result of the smell.
Thank you.
There was a bunch of questions this side. You in the second row.
Hello. I've got so many questions, but that was very fast. First one, very quickly, is will you share the slides?
Yes.
Okay. And second, at the very beginning, you mentioned something about being around red leaves evokes more of an angry sort of feeling. But autumn, being in the forest in the autumn, with it all being red and crunchy and lovely and all the leaf litter and everything's alive and looks beautiful, that kind of really calms me personally. So I was just wondering, could you explain that a bit more?
So I write about that in the book because I was exactly the same as you. I think it was just crazy. You know, we all flock to see the autumn colours, so why is it? But actually, that's the one study where, there are a number of studies, we're quite fickle with colour. So our perceptions of colour and how they make us feel change. And in the autumn, when the leaves turn, suddenly we like that colour. And then after autumn, we go back to not liking it. So it's a really interesting, and I do think colour also has a cultural association with it, and I think it's quite hard to differentiate. But certainly the studies they've done where they look at people's preferences for colour, they change significantly. There's a very nice study which I talk about in the book that shows that when you get to autumn and when the leaves are turning red, all of a sudden people's preference for red and red leaves shoots up, and then it goes back down again.
Let me quickly take one of our online questions and then I'll take from the room. So looking through, there seems to be a theme about policy. So what can we learn from countries where the most people connect with and value nature? What are the policies in these countries that you'd like to see being considered and adopted in UK and Europe more broadly?
Oh, that's a very good question. I mean, I think one of the things we have to do is stop seeing nature, as we do in this country. Often we see it as a luxury, as an add-on, and the first thing to go when you want to put a new building project up. And I think the policy needs to be that nature is viewed as an essential infrastructure in any new build, so that when you think about where to put the water, where to put the electricity, where to put the railway line, where do you put the nature? Because some of our policies suggest we put nature outside of cities and then the cities have more space for houses. Wrong policy. So I could talk about this for a long time, but I won't. But I think some countries, I've been to Singapore a couple of times in the last year, they have it's now a garden city. They've changed the whole policy structure. Everywhere you go in Singapore, there are green walls and patches of grass. It's a really dense area, really dense city, but you don't feel it because everywhere you go, there are green walls. So I think we need to, and we haven't even touched on the cognitive benefits to children seeing green outside of the classroom window. There are big studies that are showing that those that can see green from their classroom window, test on test, improve versus those that can't. Every school child in this country should be able to see green from their classroom window. It's not hard to grow ivy up walls. I mean, we're not talking about a beautiful green, we're just talking about getting plants out there.
Great. Can I have some more questions from the room? That gentleman at the back there.
Hi. Getting plants out there. I'm trying to do that in my community in London. We've got rain gardens going in, which are fantastic, but they're not in particularly good condition. I was down the pub with my neighbours the other night, and they started talking about their health, and they started bringing out their apps and telling me all this crazy stuff, measuring their sleep and what have you. And another neighbour told me that when we were looking after our rain gardens, we spent 5 hours cleaning them up and planting, etc., and there were a whole bunch of people doing it. He had been measuring his blood pressure, and it had dropped by 20 beats per minute or whatever.
Yeah.
I thought this was incredible, and it got me thinking, this is right on your doorstep, so you can enjoy it several times a day. You look at a nice green space full of plants and insects. how much of that improved health, in his case, how much of that is due to contacting with nature as opposed to with people?
Yeah.
And that human benefit. You know, we're all working at home. We might be a bit isolated. Yeah. Does that come into your studies as well?
So actually, I do look at that in the book. There's a whole chapter on gardening. I just thought I couldn't do this without having a chapter and looking at allotments versus back gardens versus front gardens, even window boxes. And it is very interesting. I think there of course there's a community thing in there, but there's some really good meta-analysis where they've taken thousands of studies on this and looked at which sort of garden is best for actually health, for doing exactly that sort of thing, lowering blood pressure, reducing various illnesses. And actually, funnily enough, what came out top was allotments. Partly because when they measured, and I think this is interesting because it's partly you're interacting with soil, so you're getting an environmental microbiome, but also on an allotment. I'm very snippy about allotments. I don't have one. But when they measured the species diversity, they're much more speciose on an allotment than it is in a back garden or a front garden, for example. And you didn't need to have people to get those benefits from what you're working in the allotment. But of course, community gardens are brilliant because you are also meeting with other people. But there was a lovely study where they just looked at, in an area in northern England, where they looked at people who had serious mental health issues, and they just put pots in their front gardens and found that actually just having a few flowering plants in their front gardens made a huge difference over 3 months, more so than in the back garden. And they argue in this study that actually they compared the back garden and nothing. They argue that the reason for that is because you're going in and out your door all day. So you keep seeing these things, whereas your back garden, actually some people say their back garden was stressful, and I can relate to that, especially if you're really particular about your lawn, as my husband is. You just end up thinking this is ridiculous. So it is about a very different way of thinking about plants and thinking about how we interact with them. And yes, community and that community interaction is important, but you don't need that to get the benefits, basically, I would say.
Question from this side of the room. You with blonde hair. Yeah.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Thank you for your talk. I wonder how you feel that this sort of biomedical framing of nature can avoid the pitfalls of, say, pharmaceutical industries or sort of capitalist framings we have of nature already.
Yeah.
That posit nature purely as something that serves our biomedical needs, as opposed to conservation for the sake of other species, and also conservation for the inherent value of nature. And also it ignores the fact that many people's suffering of mental health isn't from a lack of nature or necessarily, it's from inequality, and that's where our lack of, say, access to green spaces comes from.
Yeah. Well, I mean, picking up on the last point, first of all, I mean, what these big metas, the example I gave you from Wales, what they showed there was that the people who were from the poorest quintiles or the lowest social actually had the greatest mental health benefits from interacting with nature. Now, that's not to say that there is inequality about access to green space, but those people who've been the poorer quintiles who are close to green space had better mental health benefits. I don't think you can... I mean, well, there's two answers to the whole thing about nature and the value of nature. The problem with just seeing nature as something that the inherent value in nature and biodiversity being something we should all absolutely protect isn't working. It simply isn't working. And if I look at this country, I'm thoroughly depressed and ashamed about our species abundance targets and our curves over the last 20 years. So while you and I might think, of course we should conserve nature because this is absolutely what we should be doing, 99% of the people, especially if you're a developer, don't take that same view. So I do believe, and I've come a long way on that one, I'm still quite uncomfortable about putting a price on nature, but I do believe that we have to demonstrate its value to us as species. Nature doesn't care if we're around or not, but we need nature more than nature needs us, is what I would argue. So it's more about where is that balance. And so we should try and bring nature into our lives. And by doing that, we may well also enhance nature. But this is not going to sort out the biodiversity crisis, but at least it'll make us realise that actually affects our health. And the minute you start talking to people about it affecting your health, they suddenly want to start to protect nature.
That is a great segue for a popular theme coming in from online, which has to do with making the economic case for nature and well-being, and how you think this could be adopted by policymakers, or at least those advocating for these kind of changes.
I think if you look at the different budget lines and you look at the things that people are most concerned about, I think actually, you only have to look at any book that talks about diet and food and health, and it's a bestseller. I do believe that when you look at policies and you think about our main policies, one of the ones will be on health. How do we improve the health of the nation? So I think bringing nature into that policy stream is really important, but it's going to be hard, because at the end of the day, as we all know, and every day there's another story in the paper about somebody not having a particular drug because it's too costly, it has value on it. So we do need to bring a value back into this. But the value should be, how does it compare? What's the efficacy? And how does it compare in terms of the cost benefit to, let's say, another drug? And I think there probably are quite a few things that we can treat with nature compared to, there are some things, of course, we can't use nature for them. But it's working out what is that balance. And right now, we don't even think about that. I mean, if you look at our national health training of our doctors right now, they have nothing about nature in their training in 6 years, nothing. And I went to an excellent National Health Service, because many people are taking this on board, a whole symposium a couple of weeks ago in the Leicestershire General Hospital. And there were two consultants there, one from the Great Ormond Street and one from Swansea, and both of them have now started to build sort of nature gardens into their environments because they are starting to come across this evidence base.
Great. Let's take a few more questions. You seem very eager to ask one. So.
Just on this question of efficacy and value relative to, on the one hand, traditional medicalised approaches, but what's your sense of the value of nature as driving health and well-being as compared to many of the other non-medicalised ideas that are kicking around, creativity, undertaking creative tasks, activities, socialising. There's a whole raft of things that are being proposed as essential to health and well-being. How does nature as a source compare to all those other
I can't really answer that, because I haven't looked at the medical evidence base. So what I've done here in this book is every time looked at, okay, what happens physiologically? What happens psychologically? What happens to our bloods? What happens to our T-cell levels? And that's what we need to do to persuade people in the medical profession to start to take nature as a prescription seriously. We're not giving them the right tools otherwise. I don't know whether or not that's been done for some of these other things. And if it has, I mean, I don't think there's obviously not one thing. We should be looking at all of these. But we do need to kick the tires quite hard on some of these things, because what's happened with nature is it's ended up in the sort of the fluffy bunny bucket. I hate to say it, but you know what I mean? It's like, oh, that's nice, go and hug a tree. But actually, when you look at it, actually, touching wood particular wood types does lower your blood pressure. So there is something about hugging a tree in there. I'm not suggesting we do that, but we need to be really, and I mean, with this book, what I did was I got the most critical person that I know in Oxford to read each chapter and kick the tires. But I also sent all the medical bits to all the medics I knew to kick the tires, because I'm a plant scientist, I'm a biodiversity scientist, but I had to learn a whole new language. And for me, the best feedback I've got on this book has been from the medics. Because of that. So this is where I just don't know whether or not that's been done for these other subjects.
Here in the front.
Thank you. Kathy. Hi, thank you. Kathy, did you look into blue nature? I remember reading years and years ago in The Economist, they were saying that blue nature apparently is better than green nature. So just wondered if you looked at blue nature.
I didn't look specific. I mean, I know there is blue. Some people use blue-green, and particularly when they're doing these large population-size studies. So the one in Wales was on blue-green. So it's water body or green. But remember, these are correlations. They're not causations. And when you start to look at the actual, what's the mechanism of action that's happening when you interact with green versus blue, I think you see a lot more action happening when you interact with green because you've got all the different colours, shapes, smell, sound, touch. So blue certainly does have some benefits, but we don't all need to live near the ocean, I would say.
Over there.
Thank you. You mentioned about Singapore. Singapore is obviously quite a centralised state. Looking at our European neighbours, are there any good examples there of what countries that are more on our doorstep are doing that perhaps could be relevant to what might happen over here?
I would say actually Spain, probably. When I've been to various Spanish cities recently, I think with their street planning, when you start to look at what they're doing, there's a lot more green coming in. And actually, some of the really, really good studies that have gone on have been, well, in Barcelona in particular, they've been looking at the well-being and the cognitive performance of children, 600 primary school children. That took place in 6 schools across Barcelona. So I think that's my gut feeling, but I wouldn't put my hand on the heart and say that's definitely the case. But I think that's where I would say there seems to be some really good work going on in this space. But I was in Paris recently, and so this book has been translated to French, and they're saying, we just don't have the first thing that goes in planning is the green space in cities. And that's the biggest tension right now. When you look at what's happening everywhere, all across the UK, we're losing green spaces for building because we need more houses. No one should question that. Of course we need more houses, but we also need to keep nature near those houses.
I'm going to ask a question coming from online. So, you speak a little about the indoor and outdoor benefits of nature. With that in mind, do you think it should be mandated for government or caretakers to expose young people to the outdoors as part of your prescribed recommendations?
Yes, I think, but what I've come to realise from the evidence base is an awful lot of this. You can get those benefits from indoors. Mm-hmm. You can have, plants on your desk. You can have diffusers. You can have pictures of forests on screensavers. There are many ways, and there's a lovely study even of sort of students looking out onto a green roof or not a green roof, and found that the minute they went back to the task in hand, they did much better in terms of the test scores if they had looked onto the green roof for 20 seconds or 90 seconds versus the non. So I think you could mandate children to go outdoors. I mean, the worst thing you could do, though, I think, with young people, and particularly actually with teenagers, is to make this part of the curriculum and make them sit an exam on it, because that's the quickest way to put anyone off anything. And that's why I really like the guerrilla gardening movement, because it's cool, it's trendy, it's a bit illegal, but actually it beautifies really grotty areas. And there's some fantastic examples in London, but there are many places, and that's teenagers often going out doing this stuff.
That's wonderful. I am aware of time. I'm going to take 2 more questions and then wrap up. You in the front?
Thank you. I find it all very fascinating. Is quite a lot of it when you take out the kind of exposure to dirt and the pine stuff going into your blood. Is quite a lot of it the positive impacts of being calmer. Could you put it down to that actually our kind of anxious lives cause lots and lots of health issues, and actually this is a shortcut for kind of taking that anxiety out, and that has huge medical positive aspect to it.
I think that's it. So it's physiological and psychological calming are absolutely when you're looking at green and looking at green shapes. But once you have that calming, so when you're, it's basically in your brainwave activity, it's calming down. There's all sorts of different mechanisms going on. That does trigger things like lowering stress hormones in your blood, so that there are absolutely clear things going on which make you calmer, reduce the anxiety, and then all of those medical conditions that are related to having higher blood pressure, being much more stressed. So looking, seeing, smelling, touching, or even having a plant on your desk, or even roses, unscented roses. They showed that there's a lovely study with men in an office, unscented roses or not, and they showed difference in blood pressure. So it's a small thing, but I do have flowers on my desk now.
A worthwhile investment. Final question at the back.
Hi there. Got the last question, so I'll make it positive. Our clients were the NHS Trust in Liverpool for the Alder Hey Children's Hospital. And there they built a new park outside the hospital between the community and the hospital. And we built 2 buildings for mental health for them, with around courtyards that look out into garden landscapes from the circulation and look out into the park. But nobody's doing any studies of those, even though they have all that capability right there in the hospital. So I'd just like to invite you, Kathy, to look into that,
Thank you.
as well, or anyone else here.
I think that's a really good point. And we are, I mean, there's quite a few studies that are now starting up in these hospital gardens, and also with some of the specific gardens related to mental health, to really look at what are they doing? Are they really having, and it comes back to this whole thing about the cost-benefit aspects of it as well. So thank you.
Great. Well, I'm going to wrap up. Kathy, thank you so much. It's been a fantastic session. Thank you for everybody coming out today and those online that have submitted so many questions. It's been a really, really engaging discussion. If you're an RSA fellow, please keep the conversation going on our digital platform. You'll also have a link to Kathy's book available, which you're welcome to buy, and she's also doing a book signing outside. If you've enjoyed today's events, consider making a donation to help us continue to share kind of world-changing ideas like Kathy's with everybody, everywhere for free. You'll find links on screen and in the chat. And yes, huge, huge thank you to Kathy for coming out and answering our questions.
It's a pleasure. Thank you for having me.